In 1892, Thomas Edison walked into a meeting room expecting a financing discussion. When he walked out, his name had been erased from the company he'd built. The new entity was called General Electric. No Edison anywhere in it. The man who made the decision wasn't an inventor, an engineer, or even a competitor. He was a banker. His name was J.P. Morgan. That same year, 300 Pinkerton agents floated up the Monongahela River on barges, heading for Andrew Carnegie's Homestead Steel Works to break a strike. 7 workers and 3 agents died in the gunfight that followed. Carnegie wasn't even in the country. He was vacationing in Scotland. The man who ran the most efficient industrial machine in the world couldn't be bothered to show up for its ugliest moment. 9 years later, Carnegie would sell that machine, every mine, every furnace, every mile of private railroad, to the same banker who had taken Edison's company, and the price tag would be so large that it represented nearly 2.5% of the entire American economy. These are not separate stories. They are the same story, told 3 times. The stories of how financial capital consumed industrial capital, how the men who built products were, one by one, replaced by the men who controlled capital structures. And if the first episode of this series was about how free markets collapse into monopoly, this episode is about what happens next, when the monopolists themselves discover that there's someone above them in the food chain. But before we get to Morgan, we need to talk about the woman who cracked open the first monopoly. Because without her, none of what followed would have happened the way it did. Ida Tarbell was born in 1857 in Erie County, Pennsylvania, the heart of America's oil country, 2 years before Edwin Drake struck the first commercial well. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, rode the oil boom like everyone else in the region. He started by building storage tanks for crude, then moved into oil production and refining. The family built a comfortable life in Titusville, the boomtown capital of Pennsylvania oil. Then Standard Oil arrived. The South Improvement Company scheme, the secret railroad rebate arrangement we covered in the last episode, hit the Tarbell family directly. Franklin Tarbell watched as his shipping costs doubled overnight while Rockefeller's stayed flat. He joined the Petroleum Producers Union, organized protests, fought back through every channel available. It didn't matter. One by one, his colleagues sold out to Standard Oil or went under. Franklin's business survived, barely, but the prosperity was gone, replaced by a grinding, decade-long decline. Ida Tarbell, 14 years old when the Cleveland massacre happened, watched her father's world collapse in slow motion. She later wrote, "Out of the alarm and bitterness and confusion, I gathered from my father's talk a conviction to which I still hold, that what had been undertaken was wrong." She didn't forget. She went to college, studied in Paris, became a teacher, then a journalist. In 1894, she joined McClure's magazine, one of the most influential publications of the progressive era. And in 1901, when her editor asked what she wanted to write about next, Tarbell said, "Standard Oil." What followed was one of the most consequential acts of journalism in American history. Between November 1902 and October 1904, Tarbell published a 19-part series in McClure's, later collected as a book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, that systematically dismantled the mythology around Rockefeller's empire. Her method was devastatingly simple. She didn't editorialize, didn't moralize, didn't call Rockefeller names. She just laid out the facts, the railroad rebate contracts, the secret drawback arrangements where competitors' shipping fees were kicked back to Standard Oil, the forced acquisitions, the pattern of predatory pricing, cut prices in markets where competition existed, raise them in markets where it didn't. She cross-referenced court records, state legislative testimony, railroad company filings, and the records of the 1880 Hepburn Committee investigation that had exposed the 5-to-1 shipping cost disparity between Standard Oil and independent refiners. And she had an inside source that Rockefeller never saw coming. Through a connection arranged by Mark Twain, who was a personal friend and financial dependent of Standard Oil's vice president, Henry Rogers, secured a series of private interviews with Rogers himself. The relationship between Twain and Rogers is one of the stranger footnotes of the Gilded Age. Twain had nearly gone bankrupt from bad investments, and Rogers had quietly managed his finances back to solvency. When Tarbell needed access to Standard Oil's inner circle, Twain made the introduction. Rogers was brilliant, charismatic, and spectacularly overconfident. He believed he could charm Tarbell into writing a puff piece, that a few hours of his company, some carefully curated anecdotes about Standard Oil's efficiency, and his personal magnetism would be enough to steer a female journalist toward a favorable narrative. He invited her to his office repeatedly over 2 years, answering her questions with the easy manner of a man who believed he was controlling the conversation. He was not controlling the conversation. Tarbell was running a 2-track operation. In Rogers' office, she listened, took notes, and asked follow-up questions that seemed innocent. Back at her desk, she cross-referenced everything Rogers told her against the public record: court transcripts, railroad commission filings, state legislative testimony, the Hepburn Committee proceedings. Where Rogers' account diverged from the documented facts, she didn't confront him. She just kept the discrepancy and moved on to the next question. By the time the series began publishing, Tarbell had assembled a factual architecture so detailed that Standard Oil's lawyers couldn't find a single actionable error. Rogers, realizing too late what he had enabled, reportedly never spoke to Twain about the affair again. The impact was immediate and enormous. McClure's circulation tripled from roughly 100,000 to 300,000 during the 2-year serialization. The series was the most widely read work of investigative journalism in American history up to that point. Public opinion, which had been diffuse and unfocused in its suspicion of the trusts, suddenly had a target, a narrative, and a mountain of documentary evidence. Tarbell didn't write editorials. She didn't call Rockefeller a villain. She laid out the railroad rebate contracts, the drawback arrangements, the pattern of predatory pricing, cut in competitive markets, raise in captive ones, and let the facts speak. When someone later asked whether she'd written the series out of anger, she answered, "I was not angry, I presented the facts. The anger was the reader's affair." The political class noticed. Tarbell's investigation didn't directly cause the antitrust suit against Standard Oil. The legal machinery was already grinding, slowly, but it created the public pressure that made political action unavoidable. No senator could afford to look soft on Standard Oil after 300,000 Americans had read, in granular detail, exactly how the company operated. But facts alone don't break monopolies. You also need a law and a president willing to use it. The Sherman Antitrust Act had been on the books since 1890, named after Ohio Senator John Sherman, who had pushed it through Congress as a response to growing public anger about the trusts. On paper, it was sweeping. Section 1 prohibited any contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade. Section 2 banned monopolization or attempts to monopolize. Violations could result in fines, imprisonment, and forced dissolution. In the words of the legislation itself, the goal was to protect trade and commerce against unlawful restraints and monopolies. In practice, the law was almost useless for the first decade of its existence. The language was so vague. What exactly constituted an unreasonable restraint? At what market share did a company become a monopoly? That courts couldn't agree on what it actually prohibited. Worse, the Supreme Court actively undermined it. In 1895, in United States v. Knight, the Sugar Trust case, the court ruled that the Sherman Act applied only to interstate commerce, not to manufacturing. The American Sugar Refining Company controlled 98% of all sugar refining in the United States, and the court said this wasn't the kind of thing the Sherman Act covered. If you could control 98% of an industry and still escape the law meant nothing. For the next 6 years, the Sherman Act sat on the shelf. Between 1895 and 1901, while the law gathered dust, a wave of mega mergers consolidated American industry at an unprecedented pace. This was the era when U.S. Steel, International Harvester, and dozens of other combinations were formed. The trusts correctly calculated that the law had no enforcement mechanism. The man who changed that was Theodore Roosevelt. When President McKinley was assassinated in September 1901, Roosevelt, at 42, the youngest president in American history, inherited an office that most power brokers expected him to manage quietly. They miscalculated. Roosevelt had spent years as a reform-minded New York governor and had publicly railed against the trusts during his campaign. In 1902, he directed his Attorney General, Philander Knox, to file suit against the Northern Securities Company, the holding company that Morgan, Hill, and Harriman had created to merge control of 2 competing transcontinental railroads into a single entity. Morgan was incredulous. He reportedly sent a message to Roosevelt: "If we have done anything wrong, send your man to my man and they can fix it up." Roosevelt's reply through Knox was blunt: "We don't want to fix it up. We want to stop it." The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that Northern Securities violated the Sherman Act. It was a narrow margin, but it was the first time the law had ever drawn real blood against a major financial combination. Roosevelt earned the nickname Trust Buster, and more importantly, he demonstrated that the Sherman Act could be used as a weapon, not just a decoration. Then, in November 1906, fueled by the tidal wave of public outrage that Tarbell's serialized investigation had generated and sustained, Roosevelt ordered the Justice Department to file suit against Standard Oil itself. The case took 5 years to reach its conclusion. In 1909, a federal district court ruled against Standard Oil. The company appealed to the Supreme Court. On May 15, 1911, Chief Justice Edward Douglas White delivered the opinion. Standard Oil had violated the Sherman Act through a systematic pattern of predatory conduct, secret rebates, pipeline exclusion, forced acquisitions, price discrimination, and must be dissolved into 34 independent companies. The ruling was unanimous on the dissolution order itself. But White introduced something new, a legal framework called the Rule of Reason, which said that not all restraints of trade were illegal, only unreasonable ones. Courts would need to evaluate the intent, methods, and effects of each case individually. Justice John Marshall Harlan concurred in breaking up Standard Oil but dissented fiercely on the Rule of Reason, calling it judicial legislation that would give future monopolists a shield to hide behind. Harlan was right. The Rule of Reason became, in the decades that followed, exactly what he predicted. The primary tool that corporate lawyers used to defend monopolistic behavior, arguing that their clients' market dominance was reasonable, the natural result of superior efficiency, not predatory conduct. And there was a final irony that would have made Rockefeller smile. When the 34 successor companies were spun off, Rockefeller still held roughly 25% of the shares across all of them. In the months before the dissolution, Rockefeller had actually feared ruin, not because of the legal verdict, but because Thomas Edison's electric light bulb was rapidly replacing kerosene lamps. The primary market for Standard Oil's product was literally being switched off. But history had a different plan. Within a year of the breakup, Henry Ford's Model T began rolling off assembly lines in volume. The automobile revolution created explosive demand for gasoline, a refinery byproduct that had previously been treated as near worthless. Every one of the 34 successor companies scrambled to capture the new market, investing, expanding, competing. Their stock prices doubled, then tripled. Rockefeller's personal fortune, far from being diminished by the Supreme Court's order, multiplied. The names of those successor companies became the pillars of the 20th century energy industry. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Esso, then Exxon, and in 1999 merged with Mobil, itself the descendant of Standard Oil of New York, to form ExxonMobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco, later absorbed by British Petroleum. The family tree of Standard Oil reads like the Fortune 500's genealogy chart. The monopoly was broken apart, but its DNA survived in every major oil company on Earth. This is what makes the Standard Oil story so enduring and so uncomfortable. The antitrust action worked, competition was restored, at least for a time. But the concentrated wealth that the monopoly had generated remained intact, and the successor companies eventually reconsolidated through mergers that Rockefeller himself might have designed. The cycle of competition, concentration, dissolution, and reconcentration appears to be built into the structure of capital-intensive industries. Breaking the monopoly doesn't break the incentive to recreate it. Which brings us to the man who understood before anyone else that the real power in capitalism doesn't lie in building things, it lies in owning the structure that decides who gets to build. John Pierpont Morgan was not an industrialist. He never operated a factory, drilled a well, or laid a mile of track. What he did was something more fundamental. He reorganized the ownership of American industry, and in doing so, transferred control from the men who made products to the men who controlled capital. To understand what Morgan did, you need to understand a term that his contemporaries coined for his method. It worked in 4 steps, and once you see the pattern, you'll recognize it in every major financial restructuring that has happened since. Step 1. Find an industry that's bleeding. Overcapacity, price wars, bankruptcies, the exact conditions we described in episode 1, industries where everyone is losing money but nobody can exit because the fixed costs are too high. This was Morgan's preferred hunting ground. He didn't buy healthy companies, he bought broken ones. Step 2. Restructure the balance sheet. The bankrupt company's old debt gets written off or converted to equity. Old shareholders see their stakes diluted to near zero. Morgan injects new capital, not his own money, but funds raised from European investors, primarily through the London bond market. Morgan's firm had deep channels into the City of London, where old European capital was desperate for higher returns than what the saturated British market could offer. Morgan was, in essence, the translator between American industrial assets and European investment capital. Step 3. Install control. Morgan's partners and allies take seats on the board of directors. Voting trusts lock in their control. Shareholders sign over their voting rights to Morgan's appointees, retaining only the right to receive dividends. The company runs independently day to day, but every strategic decision passes through Morgan's network. Step 4. Coordinate the industry. Once Morgan controls multiple companies in the same sector, he brings their executives together to agree on pricing, capacity, and market allocation, eliminating the ruinous competition that caused the crisis in the first place. His term for this was community of interest. It was functionally the American version of the German cartel, except that instead of being enforced by universal banks through lending leverage, it was enforced by Morgan through ownership leverage. The first full demonstration of this method was the creation of General Electric in 1892. Edison's electrical business in the 1880s was a mess of entrepreneurial brilliance and organizational chaos. His operations were scattered across at least 4 separate companies: Edison Lamp, Edison Machine Works, Bergman & Company, Edison Electric Light. Each had its own management, its own books, its own overhead. They lent money to each other in circles, duplicated each other's work, and competed with each other for Edison's limited attention. Edison was the greatest inventor of his generation, but he was running his companies the way he ran his laboratory, by instinct, by inspiration, by all-night sessions and sudden pivots. There was no centralized financial reporting, no unified strategy, no coherent capital allocation. Meanwhile, a rival firm, Thomson Houston Electric Company, based in Lynn, Massachusetts, was building essentially the same products and undercutting Edison on price. The two companies were locked in a classic overcapacity battle, bidding against each other for municipal lighting contracts and losing money on every deal. Morgan looked at this situation and saw what Edison couldn't, that the electrical industry's future was certain. Electrification was coming, inevitably, but its present was being destroyed by redundant competition between two companies that should have been one. In 1889, Morgan helped consolidate Edison's scattered companies into a single entity, Edison General Electric. Then, in 1892, he engineered the decisive merger with Thomson Houston. Edison was blindsided. He had expected to maintain control, his name, his technology, his vision. Morgan gave him none of it. The new company was called General Electric, no Edison anywhere. Edison's preferred technology, direct current, was shelved in favor of Thomson Houston's alternating current system, which had the engineering advantage for long-distance power transmission. Edison was technically offered a seat on the board, but the message was unmistakable. The inventor was now a passenger in a vehicle designed by a banker. Edison later told a reporter, in a line that captures the entire relationship between industrial and financial capital, "I never had much interest in that company after that." The inventor created the product, the banker created the company, and the company outlived the inventor's involvement by more than a century. But General Electric was just a template. The real proving ground for Morganization was the American railroad system, and the crisis that handed it to Morgan on a silver platter. After the Civil War, America embarked on the most ambitious infrastructure build in human history. By 1893, the country had laid roughly 170,000 miles of track, more than every European nation combined. The railroad was to the 19th century what the internet would be to the 21st, the foundational infrastructure that everything else ran on top of. Entire cities existed because a rail line happened to pass through them. But the network was wildly overbuilt. Between Philadelphia and Chicago, at least 3 parallel lines competed for the same freight, each slashing rates to steal customers, each hemorrhaging cash. The economics of railroading had the same fixed cost curse as steelmaking. The track, the rolling stock, the stations and switching yards, all of it had to be maintained whether one train ran per day or 20. When demand was strong, everyone could cover costs. When it weakened, the price war began, and nobody could stop it. The Panic of 1893 turned this chronic problem into an acute crisis. It began with the failure of the National Cordage Company in May. a relatively minor event that triggered a chain reaction of bank runs, credit freezes, and corporate collapses. Over 500 banks failed. 15,000 businesses went under, and 1/4 of all American railroads, more than 40,000 miles of track, fell into bankruptcy. The crisis hit the federal government too. Under the gold standard, every dollar in circulation was theoretically backed by gold held in the Treasury. The legal minimum reserve was $100 million. By early 1895, it had plunged to roughly 41 million and falling. If the reserve hit zero, the United States would be forced off the gold standard and the dollar's value would collapse. President Grover Cleveland had no mechanism to fix this. There was no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no lender of last resort. The American government, the most powerful sovereign entity in the Western Hemisphere, had to go to a private banker and ask for help. Morgan organized a syndicate that purchased $65 million in gold bonds, replenishing the treasury and stabilizing the currency. In exchange, he extracted terms that guaranteed his syndicate a handsome profit and, more importantly, positioned his firm as the indispensable intermediary between the U.S. government and the international gold market. It was a rescue, but it was also a demonstration of where power actually resided. With the railroads in ruins, Morgan moved. Between 1893 and 1900, he restructured one major railroad after another: the Northern Pacific, the Erie, the Reading, the Southern Railroad, parts of the Baltimore and Ohio. The method was always the same: wipe out the old debt, dilute the old shareholders to near zero, inject fresh European capital raised through Morgan's London connections, install Morgan's partners on the board, and then coordinate pricing with neighboring railroads to end the destructive competition. Each restructuring followed the same script. Morgan didn't buy the railroad. He rebuilt its entire ownership structure from scratch and kept the keys. He had tested the approach even earlier. In 1885, the New York, West Shore, and Buffalo Railroad, running parallel to Vanderbilt's New York Central and bleeding money from a price war, had been restructured by Morgan, who then leased the entire line to the New York Central. Not sold, leased. Morgan kept the asset. Vanderbilt ran the trains. It was the first complete demonstration of the principle that would define his career: control the ownership, outsource the operation. By 1900, Morgan's network controlled or influenced over 21 railroad lines, plus General Electric, Western Union Telegraph, Pullman, sleeping cars, and a growing constellation of industrial companies. The Pujo Committee, convened by Congress in 1912 to investigate what critics called the money trust, found that Morgan and just 4 allied firms held 341 directorships in 112 major corporations, collectively commanding resources worth over $22 billion. 5 firms led by Morgan had woven their directors into the governance structure of nearly every critical industry in the United States. It wasn't ownership in the traditional sense. Morgan didn't own these companies outright. He owned their decision-making apparatus, and that, it turned out, was worth more. And then came the deal that made everything before it look like a warm-up. On the evening of December 12, 1900, 80 of Wall Street's most powerful men gathered at the University Club in New York. The speaker was Charles Schwab, Carnegie Steel's 38-year-old president, who had started as a laborer at the Edgar Thomson Works at 17. Schwab laid out a vision: merge Carnegie Steel, Federal Steel, and every other major American producer into a single entity. Unified procurement, unified logistics, unified pricing, no more price wars, stable, enormous, permanent profits. Morgan was in the audience. He didn't applaud. After dinner, he approached Schwab and said quietly, "If Carnegie is interested, we should talk." Schwab carried the message to Carnegie at the St. Andrews golf course. Carnegie wrote a number on a slip of paper: $480 million. Schwab delivered the paper to Morgan's office. Morgan glanced at it, paused, and said, "I accept." The entire negotiation, the largest business transaction in the history of the world at that point, took about 15 minutes. But here's the detail that reveals Carnegie's own financial sophistication. He didn't take stock. He demanded first mortgage gold bonds, senior secured debt paying 5% annually. If Morgan's new company thrived, Carnegie collected steady, gold-denominated interest. If it collapsed, Carnegie, as first lien creditor, could foreclose and take the entire steel empire back for free. Carnegie didn't sell his company. He rented it to Morgan, with an option to reclaim it if the experiment failed. United States Steel Corporation was born on April 1, 1901, capitalized at $1.4 billion. The first company to cross the billion-dollar threshold, It controlled 2/3 of American steelmaking on day one. Morgan's fee for assembling the deal was estimated at around $12 million, plus substantial equity positions. He had used other people's money to buy Carnegie's empire, and he would use Carnegie's profits to pay those people back. The empire, meanwhile, belonged to Morgan. So why did the builders keep losing to the bankers? This isn't just a question about the Gilded Age. It's a structural question about how capitalism works, and the answer comes down to 4 asymmetries that tilt the playing field permanently in favor of financial capital. The first is that industrial competition has no floor. Carnegie could cut his price to $17, but nothing stopped a new competitor from showing up with better technology and cutting to $15. Price wars are the industrialist's eternal curse. Product differentiation in commodity industries is inherently limited, and someone can always find a way to produce cheaper. The game never ends. The second is cyclical exposure. In a boom, Carnegie was the most profitable man in America. In the Panic of 1893, his profits evaporated. His furnaces couldn't stop. Idle assets still depreciate, and if you lay off workers, you can't restart when demand recovers. The industrialist is a prisoner of his own fixed costs. He prospers in good times and bleeds in bad ones. The banker's relationship with the cycle is exactly reversed. Panics are when distressed assets become available at cents on the dollar. Financial capital doesn't fear downturns. It feeds on them. The third is access to capital markets. When Carnegie needed to expand, to build more furnaces, buy more mines, he needed financing. But his collateral was physical: blast furnaces, railroad track, warehouses full of steel. These assets are nearly impossible to liquidate quickly. During a panic, when credit freezes, no bank will lend against illiquid industrial assets. But Morgan didn't need banks. He could package American industrial assets into standardized securities, bonds, preferred shares, and sell them to European investors in London, Amsterdam, and Paris, where capital was abundant and hungry for yield. Morgan's real product wasn't steel or railroads. It was liquidity, the transformation of frozen physical assets into tradable financial instruments. The fourth is the exit problem. An industrialist who has spent 30 years building a company can sell it to exactly one type of buyer, someone with enough capital to absorb the entire enterprise. Competitors are usually in the same capital-constrained position. Foreign buyers are too distant. The government isn't buying. The only buyer with that kind of firepower is the investment banker, the man who can issue new securities to finance the purchase. Carnegie's only exit door led to Morgan's office, and Morgan knew it. The industrialist needs 5 things to win: technology, management, market access, supply chain, and cost control. The financier needs 2: capital and legal structure. And the man with 2 advantages will always, eventually, absorb the man with 5, because capital is more liquid than steel, and ownership is more durable than efficiency. This wasn't the end of the story. It was, if anything, the beginning of a new phase, one where the tension between financial control and democratic accountability would become the defining political question of the 20th century. In 1907, 6 years after the creation of U.S. Steel, the New York stock market crashed and a banking panic swept the country. The trigger was a failed attempt to corner the copper market, a speculative play by a group of investors that backfired spectacularly, dragging down the brokerage firms and trust companies that had financed it. Within days, depositors were lining up outside banks across Manhattan, demanding their money. The contagion spread from New York to regional banks across the country. There was no central bank, no Federal Reserve, no institutional mechanism to inject liquidity into a freezing financial system. The entire American economy, the largest in the world by that point, depended on one 70-year-old man sitting in his private library on the corner of Madison Avenue and 36th Street. Morgan took command. He summoned the presidents of New York's major banks to his library, one by one, and told them, not asked, told, how much capital each would contribute to a rescue pool. He personally reviewed the books of the most distressed trust companies, decided which ones were solvent enough to save and which should be allowed to fail, and directed the rescue funds accordingly. When the New York Stock Exchange came within minutes of shutting down for lack of liquidity, Morgan organized an emergency $25 million lending pool in under 15 minutes. When the city of New York itself couldn't meet its payroll, Morgan arranged a $30 million bond purchase to keep the municipal government functioning. And he extracted his price. In the middle of the panic, Morgan engineered the acquisition of Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company by U.S. Steel, a deal that dramatically strengthened U.S. Steel's market position. He sent 2 emissaries to the White House at midnight to secure President Roosevelt's promise not to block the merger on antitrust grounds. Roosevelt, with the financial system on the verge of collapse, agreed. The spectacle of a single private citizen functioning as America's de facto central bank, deciding which institutions would live and which would die, lending to the federal government, extracting corporate acquisitions as the price of rescue, was too much for the political system to tolerate. The crisis proved, beyond argument, that the American financial system had a single point of failure, and that single point was a man, not an institution. The Pujo Committee's investigation in 1912 was a direct consequence, and the committee's findings led to the creation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, an attempt to institutionalize the stabilizing function that Morgan had performed personally, and to ensure that no private citizen would ever again hold that kind of power over the national economy. Morgan died in Rome on March 31, 1913, 2 months after testifying before the Pujo Committee and just weeks after the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. He was 75. The era of personal financial sovereignty, of one man's handshake outweighing a government's guarantee, died with him. Or so it seemed. Because the pattern Morgan established didn't disappear, it just changed form. In 1988, the private equity firm KKR executed a $25 billion leverage buyout of RJR Nabisco, the company behind Oreo cookies and Camel cigarettes. The playbook was pure Morganization. Find a cash-rich but management-bloated industrial company, use borrowed money to buy it, restructure the cost base, extract the cash flow to service the debt, and exit at a profit in a few years. The transaction was dramatized in a book called Barbarians at the Gate, but the barbarians were just doing what Morgan had done 90 years earlier, with more zeros. In 2007, Blackstone took Hilton Hotels private for $26 billion. In 2013, 3G Capital partnered with Warren Buffett to buy H.J. Heinz for $23 billion, then merged it with Kraft Foods. In each case, the structure was identical: financial capital, acquiring industrial capital, restructuring for efficiency, and extracting the surplus. Today, the same logic runs through private equity, venture capital, and the platform economy. When SoftBank's Vision Fund poured billions into ride-sharing, food delivery, and co-working companies, subsidizing below-cost pricing to destroy competitors and build market share before anyone could catch up, it was running Rockefeller's playbook with Silicon Valley aesthetics. Uber's strategy of burning cash to undercut taxi prices in city after city, then raising prices once competitors were gone, mirrors Standard Oil's pattern of predatory pricing so precisely that antitrust scholars have written entire papers on the comparison. When private equity firms buy up hospital chains, veterinary clinics, dental practices, and nursing homes, rolling up dozens of small operators into consolidated platforms, cutting staff, raising prices, extracting management fees, they're executing Morganization at the small business level. The family dentist who sells to a PE-backed chain is Carnegie selling to Morgan, exhausted by competition, unable to access capital markets on their own, left with exactly one exit door. And the PE firm, like Morgan, doesn't need to know anything about dentistry. It just needs to own the structure and optimize the cash flow. Even the cartel model survives. OPEC's production quotas and price coordination are a direct descendant of the Rhenish-Westphalian coal syndicate, right down to the same fatal flaw. When oil prices drop, the weakest members cheat on their quotas to generate survival cash, the alliance phrase, and the dominant player, Saudi Arabia, playing the role of the German universal bank, has to choose between enforcing discipline or flooding the market to punish the defectors. The cartel's structural instability hasn't changed in 130 years. Edison lost his name. Carnegie traded his empire for bonds. Rockefeller was the only one who survived intact, and only because he had already become a banker himself, quietly using Standard Oil's cash flow to buy stakes in National City Bank and build a parallel financial power base alongside James Stillman. By the early 1900s, Wall Street was split into 2 camps: the Morgan Network on one side and the Rockefeller-Stillman Alliance on the other. Rockefeller didn't need to sell to Morgan because he had built his own Morgan. 3 industrialists, 3 endings, 1 lesson. In the long run, the man who controls the capital structure always outlasts the man who controls the production line. The vehicles change. Trust certificates become holding companies. Holding companies become leveraged buyouts. Leveraged buyouts become platform ecosystems. The legal wrappers evolve with each generation of regulation, each new loophole discovered by each new generation of lawyers. But underneath it all, the physics remain the same. Competition creates overcapacity. Overcapacity creates crisis. Crisis creates an opening for consolidation. And consolidation, once complete, transfers power from the people who build things to the people who own the structure those things are built inside. That transfer happened in 1892, when Edison lost General Electric. It happened in 1901, when Carnegie sold his steel. It happened in 2012, when Facebook bought Instagram for $1 billion. It's happening right now every day in industries you use and companies you've never heard of. The question was never whether this cycle could be stopped. The question, the one that Ida Tarbell asked, that Theodore Roosevelt tried to answer, that the Pujo Committee investigated, and that regulators are still grappling with today, is whether the power that accumulates at the top of this cycle can ever be held accountable, or whether it simply migrates, finds a new host, and starts the whole thing over again.